Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Ellen Cravato. I'm the Director of Development here at New Canaan Library. Tonight it is my privilege to introduce our guest speaker. Just a few matters of business and announcements before we do that. I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your phones unless you're expecting grandchildren, in which case you can keep them on vibrate. I also want to congratulate my very incredible colleagues, because I don't know, many of you attend events here at the library, but we just had a week that was record-breaking. We had speakers here every night of the week to sell out audiences and crowds, everything from Fabergé eggs to discussions about Cuba and the Electoral College. And I just really want to congratulate the amazing staff here. Also, in case you haven't seen it on our website, we have a very special, very important event happening on November 30th. Bill Browder, who is an erstwhile financier, human rights activist, and now author, is coming to speak with us at the library. We're very fortunate that he's joining us. We've actually booked the New Canaan High School because we're expecting record crowds. We've already got 350 people registered for the event. And I encourage you to please go to our website to pre-register. Due to certain security measures we're taking, we're asking everyone to pre-register and make sure you turn up with a ticket on the night of the event. We will not be doing any walk-ins for that. And finally, on your seats, you're going to find a description of the Literary Luncheon auction, something that we launched today in connection with Amor Tolles, who will be joining us at on November 2nd. I hope that even if you weren't able to get a ticket to this year's event, which everyone knows is a hard thing to do, that you'll still participate, because these are wonderful auction items and everything supports the library, and we really appreciate that. So, as many of you can tell, true crime pairs very, very well with fine wine. Expertly shown in Peter Hellman's exciting expose of In Vino Duplicitas. Peter is a New York-based wine journalist and best-selling author. His writing has appeared in the Wine Spectator, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, the New York Times, the New York Sun, among others. His books include the best-selling Chief, Classic Cases from the File of the Chief of Detectives, and When Courage Was Stronger Than Fear. He has reported and written about many other riveting stories, such as Serge and Beate Klarsfeld's search for justice for Nazi victims in France, and the real estate cloak and dagger story of the Manhattan assemblage of the Citicorp Center, which I think must be a fascinating story for us all to know. Peter started writing about Rudy Cornea in 2008 and has covered the story ever since, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Peter to you tonight.
So, this is my very first visit to New Canaan. I've seen a Canaanite ruin on the walls of Jerusalem, but never to New Canaan. And I hope this will be a nice evening for you. It's already a very special evening for me, and I just have to back up and tell you briefly why. As a freelance writer in New York for, this shocks me to think about it and scares me, almost 50 years, I would go like an itinerant peddler from one magazine to another, try and leave before I wasn't wanted, and stay just the right amount of time. And in general, I found it best not to get too friendly with editors that I took assignments from. Let it be business. But toward the end, I had a very special editor at Metropolitan Home magazine. Some of you may remember Met Home, a wonderful so-called shelter magazine. It was more than that. It was fresh and lively. It had no attitude of the wrong kind. And I'm not a design person, but the editor of that magazine allowed me to write many stories, and she was just the best, and she's here tonight, Donna Warner. And I love Donna as almost as much as she loves horses. You still love them, right? Oh, yes. Still have horses, right? It was a very old horse, I think you had. How old? Oh, my goodness. Older than us. Older than me. Older than you, not than me. Okay. Just as a hypothetical, let me propose this. Suppose, I know no one would do this, but suppose you decided that you would like to have a little do-it-yourself counterfeiting operation in your home, where you counterfeited luxury goods. What could you do? Rolexes are out. Maybe you could try a cashmere sweater with a Prada label. Louis Vuitton bag, out, too complicated. Hermes scarf, well, if you were good at silk screening, you could probably figure out how to do all 28 colors in the Hermes scarf. But sharp eyes would certainly detect your counterfeit. So what's left in this little operation? Wine. And what makes wine, I had to think about this a while, what makes wine unique as a counterfeitable luxury product is the silk scarf you can feel, the cashmere you can feel, the wine, the product, the luxury product is locked in the bottle under the cork. You cannot know if it's real until you pull that cork, which you may not do for many years. And the rest of it, it's interesting to think that the average price of a bottle of wine in the United States of America, the one that people pick up to take home for dinner, is $8. That's all, $8. The bottle that wine is in is the same bottle that the $800 bottle is in. So it's kind of unique in that sense that the bottle is the bottle. It costs less than $1, probably considerably less. And yet, whether you buy a bottle of Lafite or you buy a bottle of Mondavi, whatever, it's the same price. If you wanted to counterfeit a label, it's pretty easy to do. You can just pull one off of Google Images, and with a good printer, you can do a pretty good job. Yes, it could be detected probably, but most people would be fooled. Here's the next thing about wine that makes it easy to counterfeit. Let's say you finally do pull the cork on that bottle, and let's say it's a very old bottle that you paid a lot of money for. Do you really know what 1945 Chateau Lafite tastes like? Do you know what 1921 Petrus in Magnum is supposed to taste like? There are people who thought they knew, but frankly, it's a losing game. And that's a good thing in a way, because wine is seductive. It's a moving target. It's always changing. Conditions under which you drink it cause it to change. I have a very dear friend, the best taster I know, Peter Thustrup, a Swede who fled to France to be near the wine. And Peter says that if you go to a cafe and there's a table with two people sitting there with a bottle of wine between them, and these people are not on good terms, that bottle of wine will not taste good. If you take that same bottle, and this is what Peter says, and if you go and take that same bottle and put it on a table where there's a, shall we say, lovey-dovey couple, that bottle will taste great. Same bottle. Peter also says that ceiling height impacts the way you taste wine. So all things considered, yes, you can feel that scarf and know if it's real or not. It's a hard thing with wine. And so we come to a gentleman named Rudy Cornea. And what do we know about Rudy? We know actually very few things that are verifiable, because most of the things that he told friends and wine collectors weren't true. We do know that he was born in Jakarta in 1976, 200th anniversary of you-know-what. And he was born into a supposedly wealthy Chinese family. And because ethnic Chinese people in Indonesia are not looked kindly upon by some of the so-called native Muslim Indonesians, parents of ethnic Chinese babies think it's wise to give them two names, a Chinese name and an Indonesian name. Rudy's given Chinese name on his birth certificate, Zhenwang Huang. His Indonesian name, Rudy Cornea. Why Rudy Cornea? This was the name of a very famous champion badminton player in Indonesia and was the national champion in the 60s and the 70s. That's a good name to sort of put you on the right side of people who might not otherwise be too friendly toward you in Indonesia. Sometime around 1995, Rudy came to the U.S. on a student visa. He enrolled at Cal State Northridge and did well, got an accounting degree. He told people early on that he had a golf scholarship. But when the longtime coach of the golf team at Cal State Northridge was asked whether he knew of Rudy, he didn't. Never heard of Rudy Cornea. Rudy did work in a pro shop at a golf course, and one day on his shift, a very expensive driver, Japanese-made driver, disappeared. And when the owners queried him about it, he said he didn't know anything about it, but when his next shift came around, he didn't show up, and he never showed up again. So maybe that tells you something about what might have happened with that expensive piece of golf equipment. The key thing in Rudy's wine life, the origins of it, he has said, was a birthday dinner for his father. Father's a mysterious person. At a restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, probably in 1999, possibly 2000. Interestingly, Rudy, who had an absolute lockdown memory for everything that had to do with every bottle of wine he ever drank, and that was many thousands, could never remember the name of the restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf. So be it. At this dinner, he ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. It was a bottle of 1995 Opus One. Many of you might know Opus One, a cult Napa Valley Cabernet. And this bottle just knocked him back. It was a new experience for him. It was a true epiphany. And after that dinner, he went home to the house he shared with his mother in Arcadia, California, outside of LA, and he began to buy every bottle of Opus One that he could find in the Los Angeles area. And we're talking hundreds of bottles of Opus One. And he began to open them day and night and try and detect differences between vintages. And he began to go to tastings, first at wine shops, and he was right from the get-go very generous. He would bring big bottles and expensive bottles and readily open them for other tasters. And of course, this got him known and liked, because when you bring the good wine, people like you. People invite you back, especially if it's more expensive than you yourself might buy. Rudy seemed to have a lot of money. His explanation was that his family back in Indonesia, he said to some people, controlled the Heineken beer franchise for Indonesia and possibly for other places in Asia. Wasn't true. Rudy said that he went to a school in Singapore which was favored by wealthy Indonesian families. Bill Koch, one of the four Koch brothers, bought quite a bit of Rudy's wine, was very unhappy to discover that it was fake, and Bill Koch is a litigious fellow. He sued his own twin brother for 20 years, and even in the process of that, deposed his own mother, who was in her 80s. But they made up, and at Bill's third marriage, David Koch was his best man. So all's well that ends well, right? So Bill Koch is litigious, likes to sue people. He almost sued me, but that's another story. The way I make a cup of coffee, Bill sends out sue somebody. He hired retired FBI agents, retired National Security Agency operatives. He hired the former CIA station chief in Jakarta to build a family tree of Rudy's family. We'll get to that in a minute. That turned out to be interesting. And he really spared nothing. Rudy said, we controlled the Heineken beer franchise, and even in some places in China. Bill Koch paid for ex-FBI agents to go all over Indonesia and China to determine who sold Heineken beer, and it wasn't Rudy's family. It cost more than 50 cents to send somebody over there. So it turns out almost nothing that Rudy said could be verified, except when it was false. And very quickly, he rose to become a dealer in wines. Well, he moved from those California Cabernets to big Barossa Shirazes from Australia. Like many of us, he started with the big impact wines. And like many of us, he went on to more subtle wines. His next stop was Bordeaux, and the stop after that was Burgundy. And he began to buy wines from dealers in the United States, in the UK, in France. He was like one of those big nets, these monster nets that trawlers sweep up everything from the ocean floor. He was just buying everything he could. And he told people that he had an allowance of $1 million per month. And one of the few true things that he said was, I could never make it to the end of the month. It was all gone before long. And that seemed to be true. He was spending over $1 million worth of $1 million per month on wine over quite a few years, sometimes close to $1 million per week. It's mind-boggling. And he was buying all kinds of wines, but he was always looking for the rarest wines. And so he was able to find probably the last bottles on earth of certain wines. From Bordeaux, tiny Chateau Lafleur, the two Robin sisters, two little old French ladies in Pomerol who owned this estate. They were born in a bedroom in the farmhouse there, and they both died in the bedroom in the farmhouse there, slept in the same bed their whole lives. Robert Parker, the critic, went there for the first time, I think probably the early 1970s. And when he went into the chai where the wine is being aged, he said there were chickens and pigs and all McDonald had a farm. All those animals were in the chai, and no doubt their droppings were there too. And yet, he said when he tasted the 1947 Chateau Lafleur made by the Robin sisters, it was the only wine in his entire life that brought tears to his eyes. So that tells you something maybe about cleanliness in and a shea. And, I mean, it was superb properties, superb soil, but they did something special. They only made about, I think only about 1,500, maybe 2,000 cases maximum of wine per year. And in 1947, the Robin sisters told a visiting English critic that in 1947, they made 6 magnums of that vintage. Rudy Cornea sold 18 magnums over 2 years, 2005, 2006. Only 14 magnums. And preceding him was another character and counterfeiter named Hardy Rodenstock, who also sold, he's the one who sold 18, but over a much longer period. If you went to a legitimate dealer in fine old wine, they would tell you that these wines were effectively extinct by the turn of the century. Because wine, it doesn't reproduce itself in that same vintage. Yes, every spring there's flowering of the vines, every fall there's harvest, but if it was 1947 or another great vintage, 1945, 1970, once it's gone, it's gone. Funny, I think about this. My earliest experience with my mom, you can eat an avocado and mash it up with little bits of onions and herbs and everything, and then you can take that huge pit and you can put it in water. When I was about 5, my mother did it, and it eventually will grow roots and leaves. So it does reproduce. There's an agricultural product that reproduces itself, but wine doesn't do that. And yet Rudy was able to consistently find bottles of these wines. I say find in quotes. He was a source for unbelievably rare wines. And now, let me jump forward here a little bit. No, before I do that, I want to say that it was amazing how fast Rudy became probably the number one wine dealer on earth. From the time of this epiphany at the restaurant, which he couldn't remember, on Fisherman's Wharf, by 2002, he was already selling wines of extraordinary rarity to billionaires. Just going to see here if I can find. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And I'm going to read you an email. This is an email conversation between Rudy Cornea and Brian Devine, who was then the chairman of Petco, the pet store empire. Here's an email dated September 16th, 2003. Bear in mind, he's just getting going. Brian, here's the shortened list of the most incredible offering from the $20 million seller. What that is it's the $20 million seller, so-called. They are priced reasonably low, 20 to 25% below auction, as the family would like to liquidate ASAP. Please keep in mind that the list is offered to major brokers and collectors as well. This may be the only chance to get some of the rarest bottles that still exist in the world. Who's talking here? Like a 26-year-old guy who's rarest bottles that still exist in the world, and prices are extremely fair and low. The provenance are definitely great, without any doubt, and authentic. Please kindly advise ASAP. Cheers, Lenny. Why Lenny? He was using an alias. He wasn't using his own name for reasons I'm not sure what they are. He called himself Lenny. His own mother's name is Lenny Waddy Tan, but the email address that he was using was his own. P.S. You might be the largest collector in the country with all the rare wines you have. Buttering them up a little bit. Lenny's email address, hzw@hotmail.com, is actually Cornea's. First 3 letters corresponded to his initials of his Chinese name. 4 days after receiving the, quote, most incredible offering, close quote, Divine promised to send Lenny a check for $638,183 and added, P.S. I have spent $1.5 million in 3 months. Glad I haven't known you for years, or my wife would have shot me. By July 2005, Divine had written 34 checks to Lenny, totaling $5,320,602.50. At no time did he meet the dealer or suspect that he was actually Cornea. Quote, all my purchases were done through internet communications, Divine wrote in an affidavit in June 2014. This is the chairman of Petco. I mean, you know, being wrapped around the finger of this young guy. It's crazy, it really is. But here's the thing. Rudy was a master con man, and it's very hard for us to know how people like this can push buttons in, shall I say, normal people. All of us tell, I think, sooner or later, if we tell little white lies, we may hold something back, or we do various things when we don't want to be very direct. There are just times you have to do that. But what we don't understand is someone who just looks right at you with all the seeming honesty in the world and lies blatantly to you and pushes the buttons through generosity, especially, to make you do things you just want to do. There was a marvelous book published in 1960 by I think an anthropologist named David Maurer. It's called The Big Con, and in it, right up front, he says, the master con men pride themselves in never taking your money. You thrust it into their hands. 34 checks for $5,320,000. There you are. And I'll just tell you in a minute how he hoodwinked me, actually. My entry into the story of Rudy came on April 25th, 2008. In the late afternoon, I got a call from a dealer who had always been very helpful to me, specializing in rare wines. And he said, you should go down to the Acker, Maryland Condit auction at Crew at 6 p.m. I said, oh, why, Jeffrey? He said, because they're going to withdraw 22 lots of Domaine Ponceau Burgundies, very old ones, because the fourth generation proprietor, Laurent Ponceau, says they're fake. And not only that, but he's flying in from Burgundy as we speak to make sure that the auctioneer, John Capon, some of you may know him, I know some here do, is going to withdraw those wines. So I went down there to Crew, and you may know this was at the time the true temple of wine in Manhattan. A very wealthy Wall Streeter had basically given his wine collection worth tens of millions of dollars. Didn't give it to Crew, but instead of selling his wines reselling his wines at auction, he had the smart idea to sell them at better prices through the restaurant. And really big wine honchos, winolas in New York and everywhere else would come to Crew, and they would find extraordinary things. 2 big wine lists, size of the telephone book, one for reds, one for whites. Excuse me. And this restaurant was down just above Washington Square on Lower Fifth Avenue. And I got there 15 minutes late. And here's what happened as I entered is a good example of how crazy the wine game was back then. This was the end of it. But they were up for auction at that moment were 2 bottles of Dom Perignon Rosé, vintage 1959. Old, maybe too old. And the story behind them was that the Shah of Iran had bought the entire supply of Dom Perignon 1959 to be served at the multi-day celebration of the 2000th anniversary of the Pahlavi reign in Iran. He wasn't going to last much longer than that, was it? But of course, a smart cellar master in Champagne was not about to give up all his bottles of DP 1959 Rosé. So apparently some were held back and 2 were being auctioned as I entered Cru. The estimate for that wine was $5,000 to $6,000 for 2 bottles. Quite a bit for wine that may not be any good anymore. As I came in, they were hammered down for $84,000. Now, it really makes no sense, especially when you try to remember that wine is an agricultural product. It has, if you buy a Picasso for $50 million, okay, that's a lot of money, but it can hang on your wall as long as you want, and you can resell it, you can give it to your children, you can do a lot of things with it. A bottle of wine like that has a maximum life of 45 minutes once the cork is popped or pulled. So do you really want to, who are you going to open that for? I mean, there's an A-list, but, you'd have to have like a quadruple A-list to open a bottle that costs $40,000, or you could hope to resell it. And this was a period of rising wine prices. So I arrived at Cru. This happened, and midway through the auction, and these wine auctions go very fast, they have to, John Capon, the auctioneer, paused the action and said, something a little unusual here. At the request of the domain Ponceau, and with the consent of the consigner, Rudy Cornea, unnamed, but everybody knew it was Rudy, I'm withdrawing the next 22 lots of domain Ponceau. Whereupon I watched somebody people were drinking wine all the time at these auctions, good wine. John Capon learned quickly that if you pass around a lot of wine, people sometimes forget to put their paddle down and, and the prices go up. And somebody yelled out the F word, F you, somebody who wanted to pay $60,000 per case for this wine, this Ponceau wine. And that was it. I didn't know that shortly after I arrived, Laurent Ponceau had taxied in from JFK and took a seat and watched to be sure that his wine was indeed withdrawn. And he later said to me, some proprietors don't care. They're very happy to see crazy prices for their wine at auction. But he said, for me, I know someday a person will open a bottle that says Ponceau, which isn't real, and they'll be disappointed, and my name will be on that bottle, and I don't want that. And there were at that time other definitive fakes being offered, and I got in touch with the domains, and they just didn't want to be bothered with it. Where these people want to pay those prices, as the French say, tant pis, too bad. At the end of the auction, I asked the wine director, Robert Bohr, is Rudy here? And he said, yeah, he's that little guy over in the corner. Rudy normally, I learned, liked to mix and mingle very much, but he was kind of cowering in a corner in a beautiful Hermes suit, and he knew something bad had just happened, even if nobody else knew it at the time. The assumption was Rudy buys all this wine, $40 million worth between 2004 and 2008, from all sorts of sources in the world. So somebody sold him some bad wine, and he'll have to figure out who it was and reveal that. Anyway, I went over to the corner where Rudy was, and normally I identify myself as a journalist. I'm not an undercover type like those FBI agents and CIA guys and everything. And I just let Rudy think I was a collector, and I said, hey, Rudy! And I see he's looking at me with these dark eyes, trying to figure out, who is this guy? I must know him from somewhere. He didn't. I said, Rudy, what happened with those 22 lots of Domaine Ponceau? And I saw him thinking what to answer. And finally he said, well, we try our best, but it's Burgundy and shit happens. And that's what he said. And he turned away, didn't want to say any more. I ran off to another corner and I wrote down in my catalog, we try our best, but it's Burgundy, shit happens. It's still there in my catalog, if anybody wants to see. What had happened here for Laurent Ponceau to be so certain that these wines were counterfeit? The catalog showed amongst the 22 lots, 7 lots of Clos Saint-Denis, one of the 32 great Burgundies, the greatest Burgundies. And they were listed in vintages 1945 through 1971. And there were a couple of collectors of Ponceau, devoted Ponceau collectors in New York who had never seen Clos Saint-Denis from Domaine Ponceau of this age. One of them, his name is Michael Rockefeller, that tells you the kind of money you have to buy these things, called Ponceau in Maurice Saint-Denis, the little town where the family generation after generation lived. Maurice Saint-Denis is so small that the older labels say Domaine Ponceau à Maurice Saint-Denis près de Gevrey-Chambertin, because there was no post office in Maurice. I went there myself at midday. I think I circled the church, and around I saw, I think, 2 cats and 1 dog, but no human beings in Maurice Saint-Denis. It's a little quiet place, as are most Burgundian villages, even if they're known worldwide. So anyway, when Ponceau got this call to be told that 1945 through 71 Clos Saint-Denis were being offered in this auction, he said to me, I'm glad I was sitting down because I would have fallen down. And he said, my father had no access to the vines of Clos Saint-Denis until 1982. So here was an open and shut case, usually with wines which are thought possibly to be counterfeit or accused of being counterfeit. People argue about it, they look at the labels, they look at the cork if they can, they do whatever they can to try and decide. With Petrus, a wine that, because it's the most expensive wine of Bordeaux, is sort of assumed to be guilty rather than innocent. People look at that key in St. Peter's hand on the label and they say, oh, the key isn't just quite printed right here. But there's no definitive way to know. And even as we said, if you open the bottle, that's still not definitive. On that point, at this auction, there was actually millions of dollars worth of champagne being offered by a huge champagne collector, Robert Rossania. And he always brings expensive bottles. He brought a bottle of 1928 Chateau, Petrus in Magnum. And it was poured by the wine director, Robert Bohr, for his chosen friends. I was kind of watching this. I guess Robert Bohr took pity on me and he said, Peter, would you like to try this wine? I said, yeah. I never imagined anything that old. And he poured me a small pour in a glass. And I can tell you, I was just transfixed by that wine. It seemed to billow up with soft, rounded Merlot flavors that were rich, but also just had pure curved contours. And the aromas were so settled down and yet so rich. Was it the real thing? Right now, I'm sure it's not, wasn't. But, you know, wine seduces people. You want to believe. I wanted to believe that 1928 Petrus out of Magnum. And by the way, there are no records to definitively show it, but most probably Petrus never, at the property, never made any Magnums in 1928. It was just a little farm until Robert Parker kind of sung its praises. They didn't, you know, it's expensive. Once you make a Magnum, you have to buy a big bottle, then you have to make a bigger label. They didn't do that kind of things in those days. Anyway, the next day after that auction, there was a tense lunch at Nougatine, at Jean-Georges, at Columbus Circle. At this lunch were John Capon, the auctioneer, Rudy Cornea, Laurent Ponceau, and a gentleman named Doug Barzilay, a well-known Burgundy collector who had been one of those who had sounded the alarm over these close Andenese. And Ponceau told me that at the lunch he waited for the courtesies to be done, and somewhere along the first third of the lunch, he looked at Rudy and said, "You know, Rudy, you have to tell me where you got those bottles of Ponceau, because I want to track them down and I want to stop this." And Ponceau says, at that moment, Rudy looked down in his plate, and Ponceau took that as a bad sign, just looking at his plate. And Rudy said, "Well, you know, I don't keep receipts, and I buy so much wine, and I just throw the receipts away the next day." And to which Ponceau said, "Well, maybe with some wines, but if I buy a Maserati, I'll remember where I got it." And in effect, he was saying, my wines are the Maseratis of Maurice Saint-Denis, and they're priced accordingly. And by the way, there are only about 200 cases of Ponceau Clos Saint-Denis. So Rudy did promise he would try and figure out where he got the bottles. And time passed and nothing. Meanwhile, I'm assigned to write a story. I called my editor at Wine Spectator and said, "Hey, Mitch, you know, something interesting happened last night at this Acker auction. They withdrew these 22 lots of Domaine Ponceau." And he said, "Okay, go write a story about it." Uh-oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. All right, let's look at some pictures. I'm supposed to be in the word business, but if it's not satisfactory, then we go to the picture business here. My wife made this, and she's very graphically oriented. So okay, here's a little thing. There we go. This is the synergy between Rudy Cornea and John Capon of Acker Merrill. Wine auction sales for the year in 2006, top 200. Acker leaps from fourth to first place in global auction sales. The previous year, I think John sold a quarter of that. So in 1 year, he goes from a distant fourth amongst auction houses to number one. This is almost entirely due to Rudy Cornea's sales through Acker. In 2006, there were 2 single seller sales of Rudy's wines at Acker. One in January, which was about $11 million, and one in October that was $25 million. All Rudy's wines. The $25 million auction was the largest auction by far ever was. And now, if I can make this go here, here's Rudy Cornea with the Pope of Burgundy, Aubert de Vilaine, the co-proprietor of Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, and Aubert de Vilaine spearheaded the effort to get Burgundy named a World Heritage Site as a cultural site, not as an agricultural or physical site, because the culture of Burgundy is so tied up, the vines with the people over so many centuries, that Aubert felt it's not just wine, it's everything about us here in Burgundy. This was at a tasting of 75 vintages of Romanée-Conti held in spring 2007. And this is really a great moment for Rudy, because there's some film out there about people studying to be master sommeliers, and somebody says in the film, like, you know, if I ever got to go to Romanée-Conti and if I ever met Aubert de Vilaine, it would be like, I don't know, meeting Babe Ruth. In 2002, Rudy was famous. Oh, are we getting too late here? Okay. You see here, he's just a young kid, really. He's bidding on a barrel of wine from Sine Qua Non, SQN. Some of you may know this is an ultimate cult wine in Central California. And the word about Rudy was he would just hold his paddle up and never take it down until he won. And you can sort of feel that happening. He's not taking that paddle down. And that wine was labeled Rudy Matt. Matt was Matt Lichtenberg, a Hollywood agent, and the two of them together bought this case, and the wine was made into bottles for them. And it kind of put Rudy on the map. Well, in a way, he was already in the map, but that's our boy. That's the very serious Laurent Ponceau. He referred to this stage of his life as when he wore his Jesus-length hair. And he kind of does look like Jesus in a way. Now his hair is short. Bill Koch, looking pretty serious there. Now, I wrote this story, and Bill Koch said to me, I plan to put people in jail. And I remember thinking, it's never going to happen, Bill. The feds aren't going to prosecute people. They've got much more important things to do. They've got terrorism to deal with. They've got drug lords to deal with, Wall Street shenanigans. They are not going to spend the taxpayers' money to prosecute a wine counterfeiter because some billionaires are too careless to check what they're buying. But he was right. He did do that. We won't go into where and how Rudy was arrested. That's a long, interesting story. Hint, hint, read it in the book. When Rudy was arrested, March 8th, 2012, at his home on the end of a cul-de-sac in Arcadia, California, this is what the FBI agents saw at the doorway. Oops, sorry, go back one. Oh yeah, the little red button. Here we go. So this is you can see the door here, the door handle. And the first thing they saw were an enormous pile of wine cases. We'll leave that one alone for now. The kitchen of Rudy's house. What have you got in your kitchen? Pop-Tarts and stuff like that. Rudy covered the floor, covered the counters, and by the way, covered the window with foil. Why did he do that? You think he didn't want people next door to see what he was doing? There's a treadmill down here, which is completely covered with bottles that are unlabeled. And you see he's got bottles here prepared for whatever he's planning to do. He's got bottles up there that some of you may see a Heights Cabernet there. Not to say too much about it, but Rudy was a master blender. He blended old wines and young wines until they got to the point where a drinker would say, wow, this is 70-year-old Burgundy. It's kind of funky the way old Burgundy should be, but underneath is this wonderful, youthful fruit. It's amazing after 70 years that this fruit could be preserved. Well, it was good California fruit. He always blended good wine. There's the dish drainer. You can see a funnel. You can't quite see, but there's a recorking device in there. You can see in the sink, bottles soaking the labels off. These bottles here are actually oversized bottles, unlabeled. You can see they have temporary corks in them. These will be reprocessed into something quite valuable. Here's something to me is so remarkable. Rudy was extraordinarily careful and fine and diligent in what he did. So up here you see stamps for, it says Société Civile de Romani-Conti. This is a stamp meant to stamp molten wax. Where would you get a stamp like this? It's exactly the stamp that Romani-Conti uses to stamp the wax on their bottles. Nobody knows where he got it from. Well, he knows, but... and down here you see a, what do you call that thing where you spray the letters? A stencil, thank you. Again, Société Civile de Domaine de la Romani-Conti of Romanée, Côte France. This was used to stencil the pine crates that he would put the wine in. It's really, you have to admire him in how he pursued this. Okay, did we not talk about the Robin sisters and 1947 Chateau Lafleur that made Robert Parker cry? What do we see? Chateau Lafleur, Pomerol, 1947. Teresa and Marie Robin, those are the sisters who lived together. And underneath, of course, more labels for Chateau Lafleur, 1947. Bear in mind, you probably at this time could not have, for love or money, literally got a 1947 Chateau Lafleur anywhere on earth that was authentic. It's kind of, this is a drawer, I think you can see. Romani-Conti, Grand Vin de Chateau Latour. Here's a Richebourg from Domaine Jaillet. Henri Jaillet was a very, very revered winemaker. So you're seeing here the most expensive wines in the whole firmament of wines. One more interesting little thing here. See these little black things here? These are peel-off labels that say, "Ce vin doit être décanté." This wine must be decanted. Rudy's story, and I won't go into it, was that he bought a magic cellar, which were the wines that were over many decades aged by Nicolas, the big chain of wine stores in France. And every holiday season, Nicolas would pull out some of these treasures and sell them to their customers for the holidays. And always on those bottles were these little black labels, "Ce vin doit être décanté." Now, you can print those labels in your house, but these are peel-off labels. That's something you can't do at home. You need a professional printer to do that. Where was this professional printer? Not in the United States, in Indonesia. Okay, we're going to be almost done here, and we really will be done. Again, let's look at how Rudy built up his labels. There's a blank Romani-Conti label. And bear in mind, some of you know probably, there were changes in ownership and different people signed these labels over time. He did make a mistake, as you see there. That accent aigu, that little accent over the E in propriétaire, did not show up on legitimate Romani-Conti labels until 1978. So how could it be 71? There was one slight exception to this, but a late release, but it's basically, it didn't happen until 1978. And here it's legitimate, the accent there. But he did carefully build up these labels. Ooh, no, sorry, stop. Here again from Bordeaux, Chateau Trotanois, big deal, Bordeaux, Pomerol. Where's the vintage on this label? Not there. Oh, here it is. This photo takes some explaining. I'll just try and briefly tell you. Rudy, who were the people who were responsible for bringing down Rudy? One was Laurent Ponceau, most important. One was Bill Koch, spending literally $25 million on various court cases and investigations and sending people back and forth from Asia in first class. The third one, who was in a way most important, was a young assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, a second-generation Cuban-American crazy man about wine named Jason Hernandez. He had to leave the DA's office because with 3 young children and major wine storage in Manhattan, he just couldn't afford to stay with the DA. It was too bad. This is Jason Hernandez. He is truly a passionate wine person. This person, I never met her, but if you want to know what's a great job to have if you're a young American woman, join the FBI and be told you're being assigned as the FBI agent in the Paris office. She doesn't look too sad, does she? And they are here in Domaine Roumier, which is another of the wineries that, domains that Rudy favored for counterfeiting. And that's Christophe Roumier, and he's a 4th-generation proprietor. And here you can see they're looking at all these stacks of labels which came from Rudy's house. And Roumier is, they're learning what the fakes are and so on. This gentleman is a crusty FBI agent, Jim Wynn, who worked with Jason. And this is a French flic, a cop, as is that, well, he is. So somewhat before Rudy when he was being investigated, Jim Wynn and Jason went to Burgundy and visited the domains where Rudy had been principally counterfeiting the wines. And he will tell you a principal reason he went was he was planning to ask 3 of the great winemakers of Burgundy to come to testify at Rudy's trial. And he said, you know, there was no way they were going to do this unless I first came to them and showed them how serious we were about prosecuting Rudy. And this was the enabling way, pleasant way, to be sure. The sad thing for Jason, he said, was wherever he went, we were offered wine. Great wine, but he said, you can't drink it, you know. He said, if you're investigating a fraud at Disney World, you can't accept turkey drumsticks and free passes, you know, you just can't do it. So the French detectives thought this was crazy. They couldn't believe that he wouldn't accept it. Another important person, Maureen Downey. There aren't a whole lot of women in the world of upper-end wine, but she's a terrific consultant to people who think they may have fake wines in their cellars. And she's holding the trusty jeweler's loupe there, examining labels. Here you have one of those bottles, Clos Saint-Denis, Domaine Ponceau, 1945. Up there you see a little black Reserve Nicolas sticker. That was his game. Oh, I bought this whole cellar. People would say, well, how come it wasn't offered to others in the wine world? John Capon of Acre said, well, you know, Rudy paid the most for wine wherever he bought it. So sometimes it was never offered. They dialed Rudy's number first, and it never went on the market. The most expensive single bottle of wine sold by Rudy Cornea that I know of was a Methuselah of Romani Conti, 1971-78. I can't quite read here. You see the government witness tag on it, evidence tag. That was bought by a New York real estate mogul. Perhaps some here might know his name, Michael Fascitelli. He was the former head of real estate for Goldman Sachs. No fool he, right? Can't fool a guy like that. Well, Rudy fooled him. This bottle sold at an Acre auction for $85,000. Easily determined to be fake. Oh, these are artist sketches from the trial. The only victim of Rudy who was willing to testify, Big Bill Koch, sorry. Let's go back. Uh-oh. Okay, get me back, get me back, get me back. Keep going back.
I'll drive really quickly.
Okay, now go forward. What happens with somebody like me, if you have two children who are technical geniuses, you just never learn how to do anything. So, of all the victims of Rudy Cornea, only Bill Koch was willing to come and testify and basically say, I was a fool. He enjoyed that very much. At the end, Rudy still had in his commercial storage near his house in California thousands of bottles, many of them bought from reputable dealers. And so the U.S. Marshal's Office had to bring in a consultant from Bordeaux, Michael Egan, to painstakingly go through the bottles and determine what was real and what was fake. And there was a lot that was real, and there was a lot that was fake. And one fine day in Texas at a huge dump, a 3,000-pound magnet did in these bottles. You can see they've been, there I went again. You can see they've, in orange indelible ink, they've been stamped counterfeit. And what you see in front are Bonmar from Domaine de Vauquois, very expensive French wine. When all the glass was shattered, it was cleaned and then sold in a garden store as decorative gravel to put around your rose plants. It had been. Okay, so thank you very much. I really, it's nice to be here.